an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Everybody does that. At some point when I hit the sounder, we've got guests in the studio, they begin to bop along because it's just that kind of music. Does your thing, right? Welcome in. It's Monday, the 24th day of July, and it's a big day at our house. It's Marigold's 3rd birthday. Yes. Hooray. She's packing up her bags and she's coming to Upper Canada. She'll be here next week. So we might not have the podcast next week because I will be otherwise distracted. She and her big sister Piper coming to town with her mom and dad. And we're going to spend some time at the family cottage where her mom spent a lot of time as a young kid. So it's nice to be able to get to the lake and just enjoy that family time. Hoping you're able to do something similar as we make the turn into this final week of July. Holy cow, that went in a hurry, eh? Dave Trafford here. It's Now and Next for Story Studio Network. And just a reminder, if you want to check out the latest on the LinkedIn newsletter, it's up there now. Things we learned this week. Had a really spirited discussion back and forth with Lisa Taylor. She is a future of work expert, president of Challenge Factory, on ageism. And I say this without irony or any implied meaning other than what I literally am saying. That I learned this week that because I am not offended that some of the elders in my life, particularly men who taught me when I was in high school, so these guys are probably in their 80s. And when we see each other again, they refer to me as a young fella or a young man. And I'm not offended by it. And Lisa says, that's the problem. We're not offended by ageist language. And it cuts both ways. The fact is, they are somewhat diminishing you because, no offense, Dave, you're not a young man. I'm with you on that. But on the other hand, I'm letting them off the hook because, well, that's how they know me. They've always been like that. And it suggests some kind of diminished capacity. Anyways, it was a fascinating discussion. And as our demographic and the citizenry ages, the baby boomers get older, I think that's just going to be one of those things where it's going to sort of pop to the surface more often than not. Lisa says it's not just an HR problem, it's baked into the culture. If you want to see a really good example of ageism, just walk down the birthday card aisle in the drugstore. She's not wrong. Anyway, that was this past week. We highlighted in the newsletter, Now and Next on LinkedIn, at Dave Trafford. All right. Maybe to some degree we might want to get into this conversation about diminished capacity. Certainly it's not any reference to our guest on the show today, but the subject matter at hand. Welcoming in David Schultz. He's a professor of political science and a constitutional law expert at Hamline University. And, normally, before we got on the air, you were talking about how you in Minnesota kind of have the same experience many of us here in Canada have with long, cold winters. Want to be outdoors. I know there's all kinds of great opportunities to be, recreational and in Minnesota, but you guys are really feeling the effects of the wildfires, are you?
Yeah, we are. We're getting them from both directions where we are in Minnesota. Those western wildfires are sort of blowing in from us in one direction, and I think some of the eastern ones, which you told me you're kind of missing a little bit, are blowing in for us. And so we're getting a couple of days there where we're kind of getting the wildfire smoke, blowing in from two different directions. And so I feel like we're being punished at this point. We have 8 months a year where we have winter, it seems like, and now we're kind of trapped inside again a little bit here.
Yeah, it's not even like you can go to the rink and go for a skate or anything at this time of the year. You're just stuck inside. Yeah, when we've had that experience here, there's been maybe, I want to say 3 or 4 days over the last couple of months where the air felt kind of chewy. I mean, you could really taste the fire. But we seem to have managed to get, bypassed to some degree, although in Quebec, Northern Ontario, and it has been a problem. And for those of you who listen, you'll know that Erin and her family are in Nova Scotia. They had the big fires that really kind of kicked the season off very early, and we were tasting that a little bit. But other than that, we're posting this week a new episode for Engineering with Nature, by the way, and you'll find it wherever you find this podcast. And it takes an American view of the effects of the Canadian fires. And for whatever reason, it seems to be worse, David, this year than other years in terms of the way, just the airflow. They're smelling those fires, and quite a distance south in the U.S. So and the other part of it is, spoiler alert, it sounds like the wildfire forecast for the U.S., particularly California and hotspots where we would otherwise know that they'd be a problem. Sounds like it's going to be, it might be a bad season too. So it ain't over yet. So here's hoping everything works out well. Speaking of wildfires and out of control, grand jury meets and decides that there are charges that should be leveled against Donald Trump. Walk me through this, because they have, to some degree, identified the charges based on the special counsel, but they haven't really charged him with anything. Is that fair to say? Is that how this is working?
As of July 24th, that is absolutely correct at this point. And these are the events mostly growing out of January 6th, and also other events that included efforts to try to install fake electors across the United States. And it's a pretty wide-ranging investigation, but the best to our knowledge, it's going to probably key in on about three or so charges that are potentially going to be brought against former President Donald Trump. And we say potentially because, as you point out here, he hasn't formally been charged yet, but his attorneys did receive a letter from the Justice Department indicating that he is a subject of an investigation, and usually that means you are going to be charged. Okay, so what are those possible three charges? The first one is fraud. And the fraud is all about what? Efforts to try to create fake electors, or to basically trick the American public into thinking he won the election. The second is obstruction of justice, or more importantly, obstruction of a governmental proceeding, that is trying to prevent Congress from counting the electoral votes. And then the third is a civil rights statute, which is efforts to deprive citizens of their right to vote in the United States. We think those are the core charges, but of course, until he is actually charged, if he's charged, we don't know for certain.
So let's go back to the we think part to it, because it seems odd to me that these things would be floating out there before anything official was said or decided as to whether or not charges were in fact formally going to be laid against the former president. It sounds contrary to, innocent until proven guilty. We put all these charges out there, and that's what's going to stick in the minds of a lot of people. Whether you take Trump out of it, just that process itself sounds wrong to me.
Well, part of the problem is that normally, let's say if we didn't have a Donald Trump, that a Dave Trafford or a David Schultz received such a letter from the Justice Department or went to our attorneys, we would not disclose that letter, and the Justice Department wouldn't disclose that letter either. It would be something sent and saying, listen, your client is a possible object of inquiry and an investigation, and provide some other information. But Donald Trump has released that information. He has turned it into a political tool, because what he's trying to do is to disarm this investigation by saying this is political. I'm a victim in this situation here. Send me campaign money so I can defend myself. And so this is what makes it interesting, because most people would probably not want to disclose the fact that they're being investigated by the Justice Department. But Trump is throwing it out front and center, And that's what sort of changes the equation here, is the fact that he's making the disclosure, not the government.
So given that, and then it becomes this heated, breathless reporting around what is likely or possible, and because he, in fact, is the one who's released that information, how does that, or does it, sort of skew the next step in that process vis-a-vis making a decision as to whether or not, in fact, to formally lay charges?
Well, in theory, it's not supposed to affect anything at this point. And so far, it hasn't. I mean, if we look at the two previous indictments that he's had this year, the one in New York City and the one in Miami, the same thing happened. Letters went out indicating that he is a person of inquiry. Eventually, he was indicted. I suspect the same thing will happen here, is that despite the fact that he has released this information, I don't think it's going to change ultimately any decision that is made by a grand jury or by, in this case, the special prosecutor who's investigating Donald Trump. And that's good, because you really want to hope that political variables and political factors do not affect criminal investigations, regardless of who that person is.
So the way I'm reading this, then, the process was when they said that you're a target, there would be a window of opportunity for Trump in this case to respond or to have something to say to the prosecutor, et cetera.
Correct.
And once that is finished, then the decision is made as to whether or not the timing on the charges?
Yes, yeah, because again, what we're suspecting here is that part of that letter was to indicate to Donald Trump that there is a grand jury investigation. Would you like to testify at that investigation also? Of which he has that right to do so, as a U.S. citizen. Again, I suspect he's turning it down. But yes, it gives him an opportunity to respond to the investigation and perhaps provide evidence indicating that he's not guilty or that he's not culpable or something like that. But yes, it's clearly not just a courtesy to inform, but an opportunity to respond.
Now, in other cases, he has sat down and answered questions in other investigations, though, right?
That was the civil investigation. That was that civil lawsuit regarding the woman who claimed that he had sexually assaulted her. He did show up for the deposition in that case. The New York City fraud case and the Miami Mar-a-Lago case, they have not progressed far enough at this point for that to happen. I also suspect, because that's a criminal investigation, these latter two, the other was a civil, it's unlikely he's going to voluntarily testify, at least at this stage, for a criminal inquiry. Now, in the United States, just to remind people, I think it's similar to Canada. He does ultimately have the right to testify or not testify in a criminal case. He cannot be compelled to do so. He has a what we call it a constitutional right, a Bill of Rights right, to remain silent. I'm suspecting he will probably exercise that right in court, but we don't know yet, because again, we are still months away from any criminal trials. But think about what will happen here. Assume he is indicted. And in case people are wondering, if an indictment occurs, it could occur this week, it could occur in a couple of weeks. We just don't know the timing at this point. So we're speculating it. But assuming he's indicted, this would be his third indictment, of which then there's still a possibility he could be indicted in Georgia, in Fulton County, for an effort to try to persuade an election official to manufacture votes. But right now, it would be, assuming an indictment here, 3 indictments, of which the trial sequencing now starts to put him right into the middle of the 2024 presidential election.
Well, even at that, I mean, I think they set a trial date for Mar-a-Lago to begin. It's coming up in May. So, those wheels are already rolling. That's right. Yeah. And this makes it interesting, because generally you expect people who are in criminal trials to be in court. I mean, you can opt not to be in court, but it's pretty rare. You want to be there. The jury wants to see you there. They want to look you over for all kinds of reasons. And so it's going to be interesting to see how he parses his time in terms of pretrial preparation, which is going to be a lot to do,
and trial preparation and his campaigning for president of the United States. Because there's going to be points of where there's going to be what's called depositions, exchange of documents, pretrial motions. There's going to be jury selection, all kinds of things going on. And the May trial, for example, for the Mar-a-Lago is going to come pretty much in the center of the Republican national primaries that are going on, and a potential additional trials or legal action could very well take place at around or perhaps after the Republican National Convention next year. Again, we still have a lot of timing issues to think about here, but there's no question that his legal issues and his political issues have converged, and the timing for campaigning versus trial prep is also colliding.
With that intensity around the focus on it, and again, I come back to always saying, just when we think we've got this thing straight and, looking it in the eye, it turns upside down based on experience with Trump and politics in the United States. But we're beginning to hear among some of the other candidates who are running for the nomination that they don't want this to be a distraction. DeSantis is being a little bit more vocal around, sort of pushing him off, Trump that is, based on his legal issues. And I realize there's commentary out there saying, well, if it's so bad, why doesn't DeSantis say, what's wrong? It's, I think the old line, it's before the courts, let the courts figure it out, is probably a wise communication strategy. Right. But it also helps them politically because they don't have to say, wag a finger at the bad guy who, caused the insurrection. It's now, for the courts, for the justice system, the Justice Department to worry about. Let that play out. Having said that, we do not want it to be a distraction. Based on your observations of this, how much is that undercurrent going to really affect things? Because, as you pointed out in the past, if it looks like Trump's not going to get the nomination, you wouldn't be surprised to see him run as a third-party candidate or independent candidate. But that coming up October, November-ish timeline. Is this enough of a groundswell to give you any sense of where this might go?
At this point, he has consolidated his support. I mean, with each indictment, he seems to be picking up more support within the Republican Party. Right now, I still don't see it hurting him in terms of his support within the Republican Party. There are some people who are speculating that the January 6th possible indictments are different because of the visual of having seen the Capitol being attacked. I just don't know at this point, but it puts people like DeSantis and Pence in a dilemma that they know he's very popular, that is Trump. Outright attacking him or saying bad things about him doesn't help them. They want to rally around his base to say what the government is doing is malicious prosecution. But my guess is secretly they're thrilled to death by this because they need to have something that chips away at Trump's support. And I think they're really hoping something will happen. And my suspicion is very soon that we're going to see people like DeSantis, whose campaign is floundering at this point. He's going to probably have to change his tactics and actually say he's unelectable or can't win if he's going to make up any ground. Otherwise, I think what we're going to see is Trump continue to hold 50% of the support in the Republican Party and go into next year with a lot of support, running the risk that he could get the nomination and then become a convicted felon. And now where's that put the party?
Well, yeah, and I, as I watch this news unfold, and I think of you, and I wonder whether or not, there are days when you just think it would be nice if the United States had a big reset button. Just hit the button.
Yeah. Well, I did kind of a somewhat tongue-in-cheek piece a few weeks ago, and said the original plan for the Electoral College in the United States was the idea that said that the electors would be kind of like wise sages. They would be the people who would be above politics and police the system, and to make sure that only qualified people run for office. And my kind of tongue-in-cheek piece was to say, if the framers had their way, there's no way Donald Trump would ever have been, and certainly this coming year would be, a serious candidate for president of the United States. And so there's an irony. There's an irony for all the Trump people who support the Electoral College to say, well, heck, if you really want to support the way the Electoral College was designed, your candidate would never have a chance because he would be considered, I don't know what, riffraff or just unqualified, or whatever phrase they would have used to say he's not fit to be president of the United States. And that becomes a dilemma here, is that in the United States, in general, we would say that somebody who's facing multiple indictments or who has been convicted of a felony, even though you can run for president, most other offices in this country, you can't run for office. You're barred. You're barred from voting. You're barred from serving. And so we have this strange irony here about Donald Trump and the presidency.
Can't be the dog catcher, but you could be the president.
Exactly.
Before you go, I read a piece this week, and they were talking about the abortion debate in the United States and where this is going to go. And I can't remember which state specifically, but they were talking about enshrining abortion rights in the state constitution. Right. And if they were to do that, where does the balance happen between the state constitution there and then the federal constitution, which makes no reference to abortion law, but then you've got the Supreme Court overarching, looking at all of this, one end to the other? How does that help clarify or muddy the water
Sure.
in this case?
States can use their constitutions to provide more protections for rights, or provide rights that are not found in the federal constitution, so long as there is no conflict. So if the U.S. Constitution is silent on abortion rights, can a state basically enshrine Roe versus Wade or abortion rights in its constitution? The answer is yes, it may do so. And that's really what the overturning of Roe versus Wade has done, is shifted it back to the 50 states. And about half the states are now moving towards protecting abortion rights. About half the states are talking about eliminating or significantly eliminating abortion rights. Now, the only way that you would have a situation where state constitutions or state law would be overridden would be as a situation where, for example, Congress passes a law that bans abortion rights or bans abortion, which means federal law, national law overrides states, or if the U.S. Supreme Court were to actually say that abortion is unconstitutional. It probably would never say that, or it would take a lot of cases to get to that point. But it would have to take something where the federal law or constitution affirmatively says abortion is illegal.
Mm. Yeah, and again, it's interesting to me to see how that is still playing in the background in terms of a political movement, if you will, and as we move into the election season. So on the one hand, there's all the hair on fire around Trump. But again, from my view here, it still sounds as if this might be a ballot question in 2024.
It will be. We're going to see across the country abortion, even if it's not formally on the ballot, it's effectively still going to be on the ballot. It's a mobilizing issue for both sides, for the pro-abortion and for the anti-abortion people. Right now, if you look at public opinion polls, about 65%, depending on what numbers you're looking at here, support some form of abortion rights in the United States. And they're mobilized now. Unlike a couple of years ago where they were not mobilized, they are. And so what we're seeing across the country is this heavy mobilization on both sides. And if we thought that abortion was a political issue two or 3 years ago, it's even more so. And I think it'll continue to be an issue going into 2024, much in the same way that we saw in 2022. It was a ballot issue. It was a major, major question across many states in the United States.
And one thing that popped up yesterday in the Sunday talk shows, I think Nancy Pelosi was on one of the shows suggesting that Kevin McCarthy is entertaining the idea of expunging the impeachments of Donald Trump. Can they do that?
Don't know. Just don't know. It's once somebody has impeached, can a later House of Representatives unimpeach somebody? We're looking at a constitutional question of which we don't have an answer to. I think we've talked about this before. I actually teach a class on unanswered constitutional questions. This probably goes into my syllabus the next time I teach. I mean, could they formally unimpeach him? I guess they could, but what would it mean in the broader court of public opinion or in, let's say, the court of history? He's been impeached. I'm not sure anything that Congress does changes that.
Well, he's been impeached, and I'm not sure there has been any repercussion for him otherwise anyway.
Correct.
So the whole impeachment process has clearly been undermined, and not necessarily what, as you would point out, the framers didn't have that in mind when they were considering impeachment.
Correct.
David Schultz, it's always good to talk to you. Thank you. I hope you get some clear weather and get to enjoy the great outdoors in and around your place.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me again. Thanks for the audience.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Now and Next is produced by Becky Coles. Our production manager is Jamie Nickerson. Audio editors are Mike Trutler and Drew Garner. And our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Our executive producers are Dave and Aaron Trafford.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.